The morning light filtered through the courthouse windows as Sarah Henderson stood in the marble hallway, her reflection staring back at her from the polished floors. She barely recognized the woman looking back, hollow cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, hair that hadn't seen a brush in days. 4 months. It had been exactly 4 months since the last time her daughter had spoken a single word. Sarah remembered that day with crystal clarity, the way Maya's voice had sounded like birdsong before everything shattered. It was a Tuesday when David came home drunk, like he had countless times before, but this time something was different. His rage was amplified, his words sharper, his fists closer to Maya's tiny frame than they'd ever been. Sarah had grabbed her daughter and run, literally running in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a stuffed rabbit Maya had managed to hold onto. That was the last time her baby had spoken. The last time she'd heard that innocent voice say, "Mommy," or "I love you," or the childish mispronunciations that had made Sarah's heart sing just weeks before. Now standing outside the courtroom on this October morning, Sarah felt the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. The custody hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and it was now 8:47. She could see David through the glass doors at the end of the hallway, surrounded by his expensive lawyer and what looked like a legal team. Of course, David had money. His family had money, old money, the kind that had lawyers on speed dial and judges who'd gone to the same country clubs. Sarah, on the other hand, had a public defender who was juggling 17 other cases. She'd spent the last 4 months working 2 jobs, trying to rebuild their lives in a small apartment on the other side of town, and barely sleeping. The custody evaluator's report was sitting in her purse, and Sarah had read it so many times that she could recite it word for word. While Ms. Henderson presents as a caring and devoted mother, there is insufficient evidence of Mr. Henderson's alleged misconduct. The minor child's inability to speak may be indicative of anxiety stemming from the separation itself rather than trauma. The child may benefit from time with her father to rebuild their relationship. Sarah's stomach churned every time she thought about those words. Insufficient evidence. As if bruises and restraining orders weren't enough. As if her testimony meant nothing. As if a 3-year-old child going silent wasn't screaming a message loud enough for anyone with ears to hear. Maya sat beside her mother now, her tiny hand gripping Sarah's with a strength that seemed impossible for such a small child. The therapist had explained that selective mutism was a manifestation of severe anxiety. Maya's brain had essentially decided that the world was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too painful for her voice to navigate. The condition wasn't stubbornness or shyness. It was a trauma response, a protective mechanism that had locked her daughter's words away in some deep, unreachable place. Dr. Martinez, Maya's child psychologist, had been surprisingly optimistic during their last session. Sometimes, she'd said, children find their way back when they find something or someone that makes them feel safe again. But Sarah worried that sometimes wasn't a guarantee. What if Maya never spoke again? What if the selective mutism became permanent? What if the judge looked at a silent child and simply saw a mother who disrupted her daughter's life? The legal arguments were going to be complicated. David's lawyer would argue that Sarah had taken Maya without his consent, that she'd violated his parental rights, that she'd alienated him from his daughter. They would argue that her claims of abuse were exaggerated, that she was using a child as a weapon in a bitter divorce. They would paint David as a loving father who made mistakes, just a man who drank too much sometimes but never meant any real harm. Sarah had heard these arguments before, in mediation sessions where David would cry and apologize, swearing he'd change, promising he'd get help. She'd almost believed him the first time. By the 10th time, she knew exactly what he was doing, performing remorse to manipulate the system. But here was the problem. Without Maya speaking, without her able to tell the judge about the frightening nights, the angry voice, the feeling of being unsafe, it was David's word against Sarah's. And in family court, when it came down to he said, she said, the judge often sided with whoever seemed more credible. David was handsome, articulate, and from a prominent family. Sarah was a former administrative assistant who left her job to flee a dangerous situation. She was poor. She was desperate. She was a woman making serious accusations against a man with resources. In the judge's eyes, she might just look like a vindictive ex trying to keep a child from her father. Sarah's attorney, Washington, had warned her not to get her hopes up. Judges don't like to completely sever a child from a parent without concrete evidence, he'd explained gently during their last consultation. We have the restraining order from the DV incident, but that's not enough. We need more. We need the child to testify, or we need independent witnesses, or we need something that clearly demonstrates ongoing danger. He'd looked sympathetic but tired, like a man who'd seen too many cases like this, where justice didn't quite line up with the law. So Sarah had come to court today knowing that her daughter's silence might cost her everything. Maya couldn't testify because she couldn't speak. There were no witnesses to the nighttime incidents because they'd happened behind closed doors. The only evidence was Sarah's statement, the police report, the restraining order, and apparently none of that was enough. As she looked down at her daughter's pale face, at the way Maya's entire body seemed braced for impact, Sarah felt something break inside her chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't justice. This was a system that couldn't see her daughter's pain because it came in the form of silence. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, massive and intimidating. Sarah took a deep breath and squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, not entirely sure if she was trying to convince Maya or herself. "Everything is going to be okay, sweetheart." But as she guided her daughter toward those heavy doors, Sarah wasn't feeling okay at all. She was feeling terrified. She was feeling desperate. She was feeling like a mother about to walk into battle without her most important weapon, her child's voice. The cold handle of the courtroom door felt like ice beneath her palm as she pulled it open, stepping forward into the lit space where her family's future would be decided. Judge had been sitting on the family law bench for 19 years, 2 months, and 14 days. She could recount the exact timeline because she remembered the day she was appointed. It was the day after her own mother had passed away, and she'd accepted the position as a way to channel her grief into something meaningful. Throughout those nearly 2 decades, she'd presided over 3,847 family cases. She could recite that number because she'd made a conscious decision years ago to remember each one, not as case numbers and file folders, but as human stories, stories of broken families, shattered dreams, and children caught in the middle of adult conflicts they never asked for. Had learned early in her career that traditional courtroom procedures weren't designed with trauma-affected children in mind. The sterile environment, the formal language, the adversarial positioning, all of it was designed to intimidate, to separate truth from lies, to establish dominance and control. But what it wasn't designed to do was create space for healing or for authentic communication from someone whose nervous system had essentially shut down. She'd presided over countless cases where children were too terrified to speak, too anxious to make eye contact, too traumatized to function in the formal setting. And she'd watched as juries and judges made decisions based on incomplete information, simply because the children involved couldn't find their voices. 3 months ago, had attended a continuing legal education seminar on trauma-informed approaches to justice. The speaker was a renowned neuroscientist named Dr. Elizabeth, who had presented groundbreaking research on how animals, particularly well-trained dogs, could help regulate the nervous systems of traumatized individuals. The research showed that the simple presence of a calm animal could lower cortisol levels, reduce heart rate, and create what Doctor called a window of tolerance, where a person's brain could function more rationally and emotionally. Had sat in that seminar room, taking furious notes, feeling like someone had finally handed her a tool that could actually help the children sitting in her courtroom. After the seminar, had reached out to the Denver Police Department's K-9 unit. She'd spoken with Captain about the possibility of bringing a therapy dog into the courthouse for certain family law cases. Most people would have dismissed the idea immediately. Courtrooms had always been dog-free zones, except for service animals. But Captain was younger than expected, and more progressive. He'd actually been thinking about ways to integrate the K9 unit into community mental health initiatives. When explained her vision, he'd immediately thought of Rex. Rex wasn't just any police dog. He was a 7-year-old German Shepherd who had been trained as a dual-purpose canine, both for detection work and for victim support. His handler was Officer James Mitchell, a quiet man in his early 40s who had an almost supernatural ability to read dogs. Mitchell had trained Rex from puppyhood, and the bond between them was the kind that made other officers slightly envious. But what made Rex truly special was his temperament. While most police dogs were bred for aggression and dominance, Rex had been selected from birth for a different trait: empathy. His genetic line came from dogs that had shown unusual sensitivity to human emotional states, and those traits had been carefully cultivated through selective breeding. Officer Mitchell had spent months working with Rex in increasingly challenging situations. He'd taken him to hospitals, to nursing homes, to schools. Rex had been exposed to crying, to shouting, to the sudden movements of people in distress. And every single time, Rex responded with the same calm, measured presence. He didn't get excited or reactive. He didn't bark or jump. Instead, he seemed to understand instinctively what each situation required. With an elderly woman in a wheelchair, Rex would rest his head on her lap. With a traumatized child, Rex would position himself low to the ground, making himself smaller and less threatening. It was as if the dog possessed an almost preternatural ability to calibrate his presence to the specific needs of the person in front of him. When Captain had called Officer Mitchell to discuss Judge's request, Mitchell's immediate response was, "Let me talk to Rex." That conversation, which took place over a cup of coffee at their favorite spot near the police station, was where Mitchell explained the situation to his partner. "We're going to go into a place where people are scared and angry and sad," Mitchell had said to the dog, scratching behind his ears. "There's going to be a little girl there who's been hurt, and her mother is going to be scared she'll lose her. And we're going to go there and you're going to be your best self. Can you do that?" Rex had responded by placing his paw on Mitchell's knee, which Mitchell took as agreement. The morning of the hearing, Officer Mitchell had arrived at the courthouse an hour early. He'd walked Rex through all the hallways, let him sniff the courtroom, familiarized him with the echoing acoustics of the building. Mitchell understood that dogs experience the world through scent and sound, and he wanted Rex to recognize this space before the chaos of the hearing began. He'd also reviewed the case file that Judge had shared with him, the incident report, the psychological evaluation of Maya, the custody evaluator's notes. When Mitchell read that Maya hadn't spoken in 4 months, he'd felt something shift in his chest. He knew, with absolute certainty, that this was exactly the kind of situation where Rex could make a difference. Judge had made her decision to request Rex's presence the night before the hearing. She'd been reviewing Maya's psychological profile, reading through Dr. Martinez's clinical notes, when she'd come across a passage that made her pause. The client demonstrates typical trauma responses including hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation, and dissociative episodes. Traditional talk therapy may be ineffective until the client's nervous system has been sufficiently regulated. That's when had called Captain and requested that Rex be brought to the courthouse the following morning. The decision was unconventional, certainly. If she'd announced it in advance, there would have been objections from David's legal team, arguments about courtroom protocol, questions about whether it was appropriate. So had decided not to announce it. She'd simply requested Rex's presence and planned to address any objections as they arose. She understood that sometimes the most important decisions in justice required a certain degree of judicial discretion. The willingness to bend established protocols when doing so would serve the interests of genuine fairness. As Rex walked into the courthouse that morning, his nails clicking softly against the marble floors, neither Judge nor Officer Mitchell knew exactly what would happen. They just knew that something needed to change, that a child was suffering, and that sometimes the answer to humanity's most complex problems came in unexpected packages. Neither of them anticipated that this dog would become the most powerful instrument of justice that courtroom would ever see. Neither of them understood yet that Rex was about to rewrite the rules of family law in Denver, Colorado, and that his presence would ripple outward, creating waves of change that would affect hundreds of children for years to come. Maya Henderson sat rigidly on the hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, her small body compressed into itself like a frightened animal that had learned to make itself as small as possible. At 3 years and 7 months old, she was still supposed to be learning nursery rhymes and playing with toy blocks, but instead she was learning the intricate architecture of terror. Her curls, usually so carefully maintained by her mother, hung limply around her face. There were dark circles under her eyes that no 3-year-old should ever have to carry. She wore a small pink dress that Sarah had ironed the night before, trying to make her daughter look as innocent and sympathetic as possible for the judge. Sarah understood, at some level she probably wasn't even fully conscious of, that Maya's appearance mattered. That children who looked vulnerable got more sympathy than children who looked resilient. That judges were human beings with human biases, and those biases often hinged on visual first impressions. The stuffed rabbit in Maya's grip was matted and discolored from being clutched so tightly over so many months. It was a remnant from before the drinking escalated, before the shouting became a constant soundtrack to their lives, before their home transformed from a place of safety into something that resembled a war zone. The rabbit had a name. Maya had named him herself, back when she could name things, back when she could make decisions and have preferences and be a normal child. Now was Maya's only reliable friend, her only constant companion besides her mother. She held onto him like he was the only thing preventing her from flying apart completely. Sarah sat beside her daughter, one hand wrapped protectively around Maya's tiny shoulders, the other clutching her attorney's case file. She'd memorized every document in that file. She knew the incident report by heart. She knew the dates and times of every emergency call they'd made to the police. She knew the exact wording of the restraining order. She knew the custody evaluator's disappointing conclusion better than she knew her own birthday. But knowledge wasn't comfort. Knowledge was just evidence of how little it seemed to matter when you were standing in a courthouse, trying to convince someone that your daughter was in danger. At the far end of the hallway, David Henderson sat with his legal team. He looked expensive. That was Sarah's first thought whenever she saw him these days. He'd always been handsome. It was part of what had attracted her to him in the beginning, that confident, well-groomed exterior that suggested stability and success. But somewhere along the way, his handsomeness had become a tool. He'd learned to weaponize his appearance, to use his charm strategically, to smile in ways that made judges and evaluators believe he was fundamentally good despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. His lawyer was similarly polished, a woman named who charged $300 an hour and had an impressive track record of getting men custody in contentious family disputes. David's parents sat behind him, their faces expressions of wounded offense, as if the mere fact of this hearing was a personal insult to their family's reputation. Maya watched her father. Her eyes tracked his movements with the hypervigilance of a prey animal watching a predator. When David glanced in her direction, Maya's entire body stiffened. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Sarah noticed immediately she'd become exquisitely attuned to every shift in her daughter's physiology over these past 4 months. She wrapped her arms around Maya, whispering reassurances that she hoped were true. "It's okay, baby, mommy's here, you're safe." But were they true? Safety seemed like an increasingly abstract concept when you were about to walk into a room where your daughter's fate would be decided by a stranger in a black robe. The psychologist's words echoed in Sarah's mind. Selective mutism often developed in children who felt they had no control over their environment. It was a response to overwhelming stress and a desire to protect themselves. Maya's silence wasn't laziness or defiance. It was a sophisticated protective mechanism that her 3-year-old brain had developed because it was genuinely trying to keep her alive. The thought made Sarah's heart ache in a way that was almost unbearable. Her daughter's silence wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was evidence of her daughter's brilliant, desperate survival strategy. But in a courtroom, silence was a liability. Sarah had spent the last 4 months trying to help Maya find her voice again. They'd gone to therapy sessions twice a week. They'd tried art therapy, play therapy, music therapy. They'd read books about brave little girls and watched movies about characters overcoming challenges. Sarah had tried everything she could think of, creating safe spaces, removing triggers, being present and patient and loving in ways she sometimes felt would tear her apart if she had to give any more of herself. But nothing had unlocked whatever mechanism Maya's mind had engaged to create this silence. The therapist kept saying the same thing. Sometimes children find their way back when they find something that makes them feel safe. But Sarah was running out of time. The hearing was happening today. There was no more time for gradual healing, no more room for patient therapeutic processes. Today, either the judge would believe Sarah's account of events or she wouldn't. The hallway itself seemed designed to increase anxiety. The fluorescent lights buzzed with an almost accusatory sound. The floors were cold tile that echoed with the footsteps of other people involved in other custody battles, other divorces, other family catastrophes. Everything about the space screamed institutional authority and power imbalance. A 3-year-old girl sitting on a wooden bench was completely, utterly powerless in this environment. The system had been designed by adults, for adults, using language and procedures that made sense to adults. Children were afterthoughts, complications, liabilities in the machinery of family law. Maya began to rock slightly, a self-soothing mechanism that had become more pronounced over recent months. Sarah had read that this was a common response in traumatized children, a way of regulating their nervous systems through repetitive motion. She gently stilled her daughter, worried that the rocking might make her look disturbed or unstable to any observers. Sarah was acutely aware that she was being evaluated too. Her parenting, her choices, her emotional stability. Everything about how she presented herself would factor into how the judge perceived her credibility. The court officer announced that they would be called into the courtroom in 5 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach drop. This was really happening. In 5 minutes they would walk into that room. The lawyers would present their arguments. The judge would make a decision about who Maya would live with. Sarah had never felt so little control over something so fundamentally important. She pulled her daughter close and felt Maya's small heartbeat racing against her chest. "I love you so much," Sarah whispered. "No matter what happens, I love you." It was all she had to offer, a promise of love in a system that seemed fundamentally designed to punish her for trying to protect her child. That's when everything changed. Officer James Mitchell had been working with Rex for 6 years, and in that time he'd learned to read the dog's body language with an almost telepathic precision. He could tell by the slight tilt of Rex's ears whether the dog was alert, curious, or concerned. He could measure Rex's emotional state by the tension in his shoulders, the position of his tail, the dilation of his pupils. It was a language that required patience to learn, but once mastered, it was more honest than any human conversation could ever be. Animals didn't lie. They didn't manipulate. They didn't play politics. They simply existed in their truth, and if you paid attention, you could learn everything you needed to know about a situation just by observing them. As Mitchell and Rex walked down the courthouse hallway that morning, Mitchell could feel a shift in his partner's energy. Rex's breathing slowed. His muscles relaxed. His movements became more deliberate, more purposeful. The dog had been trained to recognize human distress signals, elevated heart rates, shallow breathing, the chemical signature of fear and anxiety that humans unknowingly released into the air around them. It was like Rex had a sixth sense for suffering, and that sense was now activating as they approached the waiting area where Sarah and Maya sat. Mitchell didn't give Rex a command. That was the most important thing to understand about working with a truly gifted therapy dog. You didn't direct them toward the person who needed help. Instead, you got out of their way and allowed their natural instincts to guide them. Rex's genetic predisposition toward empathy, combined with months of careful training, had created a dog that didn't need instructions to recognize vulnerability. Rex simply knew. It was as if the dog possessed an internal compass that pointed directly toward whoever needed him most. When Rex spotted Maya, something profound shifted in both of them. From Rex's perspective, the 3-year-old represented the ultimate target of his training, a small, terrified human whose nervous system was in complete shutdown mode. Every cell in Rex's body had been trained, conditioned, and genetically predisposed to respond to exactly this kind of situation. He didn't experience it as a command or a job. He experienced it as his purpose. This was what he was born to do. This was what every moment of his training had been preparing him for. From Maya's perspective, Rex was unlike anything else in her current world. He wasn't an adult who would judge her or demand things from her. He wasn't part of the system that had become so terrifying. He was simply a presence, large, calm, and utterly indifferent to her silence. In all her years of therapy, nobody had ever just accepted her silence. Therapists had tried to coax words from her. Her mother had tried to encourage her. Even strangers on the street had commented on how quiet she was, but Rex didn't seem to care whether she spoke or not. He existed in a space that transcended language entirely. Mitchell watched as Rex approached the bench where Sarah and Maya sat. He made the decision to move slowly, deliberately, giving both mother and daughter time to process what was happening. Rex's approach was masterful, not aggressive or eager but purposeful and calm. When Rex was approximately 2 feet away from Maya, he began to lower himself to the ground. It was a calculated movement, one that Mitchell had practiced with Rex hundreds of times. The goal was to make the large dog appear smaller, less threatening, more approachable. Rex's massive frame descended gracefully until he was lying flat on the marble floor, his body positioned directly in front of the small child. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability. A German shepherd at full attention could kill a 3-year-old child. But Rex in this position, lying flat, his entire body language communicating surrender and trust, transformed him into something almost magical. He was saying without words, "I am not a threat. I am here for you. You are safe." It was the most powerful non-verbal communication that could possibly exist in that moment. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd been warned by Officer Mitchell during a brief orientation that Rex might approach her daughter, but understanding something intellectually and witnessing it in real time were 2 entirely different experiences. She held her body completely still, aware that any movement or sound from her could break whatever delicate moment was unfolding between her daughter and this extraordinary dog. Maya's eyes locked onto Rex's with an intensity that was almost startling. Her small fingers, which had been so tightly gripping that the stuffing was coming out, relaxed slightly. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid for the past hour, began to deepen. Her heartbeat, which Sarah could feel thundering against her own chest through their physical contact, began to slow. It was as if Rex's nervous system was communicating directly with Maya's nervous system, sending signals of safety and calm that her brain had been desperately seeking. The moment stretched into what felt like eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Officer Mitchell remained completely motionless, barely breathing. Sarah remained still beside her daughter, and Maya remained locked in eye contact with Rex, while the dog's brown eyes gazed back at her with something that could only be described as unconditional love and acceptance. Then something miraculous happened. Maya's lips moved. It was the slightest movement, barely perceptible, but both Mitchell and Sarah saw it. The little girl's mouth opened, and sound emerged. Not much sound, barely more than a whisper, but sound nonetheless. 2 words emerged from the throat of a child who hadn't spoken in 4 months. "Good boy." The words hung in the air like crystalline structures, each one carrying a weight far beyond its syllabic composition. Mitchell felt tears spring to his eyes. Sarah made a sound, half gasp, half sob, and her hand flew to her mouth. In that moment, the entire trajectory of 3 lives changed. The impossible had happened. The locked door of Maya's voice had cracked open, just slightly, revealing what had been hidden inside all this time. Court officer, who had been monitoring the hallway, froze in place. He'd been briefed about the possibility that Rex might have a positive effect on Maya, but he hadn't truly believed it would be this dramatic. He hadn't expected to witness an actual breakthrough, a genuine neurological shift from complete shutdown to functional communication. For a moment, he considered whether he should alert Judge immediately, then decided to wait and let this delicate moment continue unfolding. Rex didn't move. He didn't wag his tail or jump up or do anything to disrupt the profound silence that had descended on the hallway. He simply remained exactly as he was, his brown eyes still locked on Maya's blue ones, his entire being communicating one continuous message. You are safe. You are loved. You are enough. Maya's small hand, still gripping, reached out tentatively. Her fingers touched Rex's soft fur, and the moment of contact seemed to send an electrical charge through her entire body. Her face, which had been so frozen and guarded for so long, softened. And then, something Sarah hadn't heard in 4 months, not even once, emerged from her daughter's mouth. A sound that wasn't words but was perhaps even more profound. Maya smiled. Not a forced smile, not a performance of happiness, but a genuine, authentic smile of a child who had just experienced the most important moment of her short, complicated life. In the presence of a dog who asked nothing of her except to exist, Maya had found the first crack in the wall of trauma that had enclosed her. Everything that followed, the hearing, the testimony, the judge's decision, would all be shaped by this single, impossible moment. Judge was reviewing case files in her chambers when court officer appeared at her door with the kind of expression that suggested something significant had just occurred. Was a 15-year veteran of courthouse security, a man who rarely showed emotion, who maintained a professional demeanor in all circumstances, and who understood the importance of not interrupting a judge during case review. The fact that he was interrupting now meant something important had happened. "Judge, you need to know what just happened in the hallway," said, his voice carrying an undertone of emotion that immediately recognized as profound emotion suppressed by professional protocol. Set down her pen carefully, giving her full attention. She'd learned over her 19 years on the bench that the moments when experienced court officers broke protocol were often the moments when real justice was about to become possible. Recounted the entire incident, Maya's months of silence, the therapy and intervention attempts that had all failed, and then Rex's approach and the breakthrough. When he said, "She spoke 2 words, Your Honor. Good boy." I heard her with my own ears, felt something shift in her chest. It was a physical sensation, almost like a door opening somewhere deep inside her body. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window of her chambers, looking out over Denver stretched out beneath the courthouse. Her mind was already working through the implications of what had just told her. A 3-year-old child who had been selectively mute for 4 months had spoken, not in the controlled environment of a therapist's office, not with psychological preparation or structured intervention, but spontaneously, in response to the presence of a calm animal. The neuroscience behind this was extraordinarily clear too. She'd spent hours reading Dr. Elizabeth's research papers, had attended the seminar, had educated herself thoroughly on the neurobiological mechanisms that made this kind of breakthrough possible. But knowing the science and witnessing its application in real time were entirely different things. Realized that she was holding her breath. She turned back to, "Where is the child now?" she asked. "Still in the hallway with her mother and Officer Mitchell. The mother is crying. The child is sitting quietly next to the dog. They're just being together. Officer Mitchell said he didn't want to move her until she was ready." Nodded slowly. Mitchell was a skilled handler, and more importantly, he understood the significance of what had just occurred. Moving Maya too quickly, inserting unnecessary adults or procedures into the space around her, would be a violation of something precious and fragile that had just begun to emerge. And the child spoke, asked, needing to confirm this one more time. Two words clear enough that I heard them. The mother heard them. Officer Mitchell heard them. "This is real, Your Honor." Felt tears begin to form in her eyes, which was highly unusual for her during work hours. She prided herself on maintaining professional composure, on not allowing emotion to cloud her judicial judgment. But this wasn't clouding her judgment. This was clarifying it. This was providing her with information that was going to be absolutely crucial to the proceeding that was about to begin. She understood immediately what she needed to do. The psychological implications of Maya's breakthrough were profound. A child in severe trauma doesn't simply speak because of an animal's presence unless something fundamental has shifted in her nervous system. The research on this was clear. Animals could regulate nervous systems through a process called co-regulation. When Maya was near Rex, her body was literally borrowing the dog's calm, her nervous system synchronizing with the dog's parasympathetic state. In that regulated state, Maya's brain was able to access the speech centers that trauma had temporarily locked away. But what was equally important was what this breakthrough indicated about Maya's capacity to feel safe, about her innate resilience, about her brain's fundamental desire to communicate and connect. If Maya could be brought to that regulated state, that window of tolerance where her brain could function more normally, then perhaps, just perhaps, she might be able to communicate more fully during the proceeding. Not forced communication, not coerced testimony, but authentic expression of her experience and her needs. Made a decision that was, by conventional standards, highly irregular. She would request that Rex remain in the courtroom during the hearing, but she knew that David's legal team would object strenuously. They would argue that the dog's presence was prejudicial, that it was designed to manipulate the judge's emotions, that it violated courtroom decorum and procedure. Needed to be prepared with not just a philosophical argument but a scientific and legal one. She pulled up her computer and accessed the research she downloaded from the continuing legal education seminar. Doctor, papers on animal-assisted therapy in high-stress environments. Recent court cases from other jurisdictions where judges had allowed therapy animals to remain present during vulnerable testimony. She began compiling the legal and scientific foundation that would allow her to defend her decision if it came to a challenge. What was contemplating was the kind of judicial discretion that could be appealed, that could be questioned, that could potentially be criticized by legal scholars and colleagues. But she also knew that sometimes being a judge meant making decisions that transcended conventional procedure in service of actual justice. The rules of courtroom conduct had been written by people who were trying to maintain order and ensure that the most convincing speaker won, but they hadn't been written with genuine trauma in mind. They hadn't been written with children in mind. They'd been written with the assumption that everyone entering a courtroom was functioning from a relatively regulated nervous system. Understood that she was about to bend the rules, not break them, bend them. The difference was crucial. She would still maintain courtroom order. She would still ensure that all parties received fair proceedings. She would still follow the rules of evidence and procedure. But she would do it in a way that recognized that justice was better served by a child speaking authentically from a regulated state than by a child being traumatized further by a sterile, threatening environment. She called the courthouse IT department and requested that they send her the video file of the hallway outside the courtroom. Within minutes, she was watching officer security footage of the moment. There it was, Rex approaching slowly, lowering himself, maintaining perfect stillness. There was Maya, rigid with terror, and then gradually the relaxation, the breathing change, the hand reaching out, and finally those two words barely audible but unmistakably present, "Good boy." Watched the footage twice, then a third time. Each time, she felt the same sense of awe mixed with deep responsibility. This child had just made an extraordinary leap toward healing and communication. His job now was to protect that fragile progress, to create circumstances where it could continue to unfold, to ensure that the legal system could accommodate this breakthrough rather than crushing it under the weight of procedure and precedent. She made her calls, first to Officer Mitchell, confirming that Rex could remain in the courthouse during the proceeding, then to her clerk, instructing that certain accommodations be made in the courtroom arrangement, then to the court psychologist, asking for consultation on trauma-informed courtroom procedures, and finally, she sat down at her desk and began writing the legal memorandum that would defend her decision if David's legal team chose to challenge it. What didn't know was that this single decision, to allow Rex in the courtroom, to bend procedure in service of authentic justice, was going to create ripples that would extend far beyond this one custody case. She didn't know yet that she was about to write the opening chapter of a completely new approach to family law in Colorado. She didn't know that Maya's 2 whispered words were going to ultimately change how hundreds of traumatized children would be treated within the judicial system. But as she sat in her chambers, looking at the video of that extraordinary moment, felt the weight of that possibility. She felt the responsibility, and she felt something else too, hope. Real, tangible hope that the system she devoted her career to might actually be capable of serving justice rather than just procedure. The moment Judge announced that Rex would remain in the courtroom, the atmosphere in the room shifted from formal proceeding to something far more volatile. David's attorney shot to her feet as if propelled by springs. She was a woman who had built her entire career on winning custody battles against mothers, on convincing judges that women were unreliable, emotional, manipulative. She had perfected the art of playing to judicial biases, and the introduction of a therapy dog into the proceedings felt like an existential threat to her entire methodology. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular and frankly prejudicial," said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "The presence of an animal in this courtroom is designed to manipulate the emotions of the court. It's a theatrical prop intended to bias the proceedings against my client. I move that the dog be immediately removed." Judge had anticipated this objection. She prepared for it meticulously, gathering research and legal precedent throughout the morning. She leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but resolute. "Ms., I understand your concern," she said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "However, recent research has demonstrated that the presence of trained therapy animals can significantly reduce cortisol levels and facilitate improved emotional regulation in traumatized individuals. This is not manipulation. It is accommodation for a documented medical condition." Opened her mouth to respond, but Judge continued, cutting off her objection. "I have consulted with this court's psychological expert, and we have determined that the presence of this dog serves therapeutic purposes that are directly relevant to this child's ability to participate meaningfully in these proceedings. The dog will remain. If you wish to appeal this decision, you may do so after these proceedings conclude." It was a masterful use of judicial authority, firm, backed by science, and delivered in a way that made further objections seem petty and unreasonable. Sat down, her jaw clenched, but Sarah could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. The lawyer was already mentally preparing her appeal strategy, already thinking about how she would characterize this decision to an appellate court. Officer Mitchell brought Rex into the courtroom and positioned the dog in a neutral location near the front of the room, visible to everyone but not directly between the bench and the parties. Rex lay down immediately, his posture completely calm and professional. He'd been trained for this exact scenario, to remain present but unobtrusive, to provide a regulatory presence without dominating the space. Sarah was called to testify first. She stood to be sworn in, her entire body trembling with a combination of anxiety and residual hope from the hallway incident. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. As she sat in the witness chair, her eyes found Maya in the courtroom gallery, sitting between a victim advocate and a court-appointed guardian ad. Maya was sitting as close to Rex as she was allowed to be, her small hand resting on the dog's back. The prosecutor, a woman named Detective James, who was functioning as Sarah's advocate in this family law proceeding, began with the foundational questions. When did you first notice concerning behavior from your husband? What specific incidents prompted you to flee? What was your daughter's behavioral response to these incidents? Sarah answered each question carefully, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about the details that had been locked inside her for so long. She described the night everything fell apart, David coming home intoxicated, his mood volatile and explosive. She described him throwing objects, his voice escalating to screams. She described the moment when his anger turned toward Maya when he grabbed her arm and shook her. He was so angry, Sarah said, her voice cracking. And Maya was so small, so terrified. I grabbed her and I ran. I didn't care about anything else. I just knew I had to get her away from him. During her testimony, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening. Every time her narrative became particularly distressing, every time the emotional intensity in the courtroom seemed to escalate, Maya's hand would tighten on Rex's back. And every single time, Rex would shift his weight slightly, press his body more firmly against the spot where Maya was touching him, almost as if the dog was actively providing reassurance in real time. It was happening spontaneously, without Officer Mitchell's intervention, which suggested that the connection between Maya and Rex had become something almost symbiotic. When cross-examined Sarah, her approach was aggressive and dismissive. She suggested that Sarah had exaggerated the incidents, that she was using Maya as a pawn in a bitter custody dispute, that her allegations of abuse were motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine concern for the child. She asked pointed questions designed to make Sarah appear unstable. Isn't it true that you've been in therapy? Isn't it true that you were taking antidepressants? Aren't these signs of instability? Sarah remained composed, answering each question with quiet dignity. I've been in therapy because I experienced trauma and I wanted to heal, Sarah said. I take antidepressants because I have clinical depression, a medical condition, just like diabetes. Neither of those things makes me an unfit mother. What makes me a fit mother is my willingness to do whatever is necessary to protect my daughter. Then the forensic psychologist took the stand, Doctor, an expert in child trauma and assessment. She about Maya's psychological presentation, the indicators of trauma, the severity of her anxiety disorder. She described selective mutism in clinical terms, a manifestation of severe anxiety that typically developed in children who had experienced significant trauma or prolonged stress. She explained that trauma-affected children often couldn't access their speech centers because their brains were in survival mode, focused on threat detection rather than complex communication. This child, doctor said, gesturing toward Maya, presents with every hallmark indicator of complex trauma. Her selective mutism is not behavioral, it's neurological. Her brain has essentially decided that speaking is too dangerous, and it has shut down that function to protect her. During doctor's testimony, something extraordinary happened. When the psychologist was describing the severity of Maya's trauma, describing in detail the ways her brain had adapted to threat and survival, Maya suddenly let out a small sound. It wasn't a word. It was more like a whimper, an involuntary expression of recognition. And then, while everyone in the courtroom watched in stunned silence, Maya spoke two more words. I scared. It was the first time Maya had spoken in the courtroom. It was the first time anyone there had heard her voice beyond those initial two words in the hallway. The words were imperfect, the grammar incorrect in the way of a 3-year-old speech, but they were unmistakably real and unmistakably significant. They were communication. They were testimony. They were the voice of a traumatized child emerging from silence. Sarah felt tears stream down her face. Officer Mitchell maintained his professional composure, but his hand trembled slightly as it rested on Rex's back. Judge's expression softened with what could only be described as profound compassion, even seemed momentarily caught off guard, unsure how to respond to this spontaneous communication. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, not just legal testimony, but a moment of genuine human breakthrough. A child's voice, emerging from months of protective silence, asserting her truth into a space that suddenly felt safe enough to receive it. Judge allowed the moment to settle. She didn't rush to fill the silence or move forward with procedure. She simply allowed the weight of Maya's words to land, to settle into the consciousness of everyone present. This was raw, authentic testimony, not coerced, not coached, but genuinely expressed from a child who had found, in the presence of a calm dog and a compassionate judge, the courage to speak her truth. "Thank you, sweetheart," Judge said gently to Maya. "You're very brave." Then she looked at Sarah, and her expression conveyed everything that needed to be said. The system had heard her daughter. The system had witnessed her pain, and the system was going to respond accordingly. The first night after the hearing, Sarah sat on the edge of Maya's bed in their small apartment and listened to her daughter breathe. It was a sound she'd taken for granted for so long, the rhythmic inhale and exhale of a sleeping child. But over the past 4 months, it had become precious beyond measure. Every breath was a reminder that her daughter was alive, was safe, was still with her. As Sarah sat in the darkness, tears rolled silently down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but tears of profound relief mixed with the recognition of how close they'd come to losing everything. Judge's ruling had been unequivocal and comprehensive. Full custody to Sarah, with David granted supervised visitation only, and those visits to be determined based on ongoing psychological evaluation and Maya's demonstrated comfort level. The judge had gone further, issuing a protective order that included specific provisions about distance, communication, and any contact that might cause Maya additional stress. Most importantly, the judge had made a recommendation that had surprised everyone in the courtroom: animal-assisted therapy for Maya, with a specific suggestion that the family explore the possibility of acquiring a dog as part of her long-term healing process. This child has demonstrated that she responds to animal-assisted therapeutic approaches in ways that traditional therapy alone has not yet achieved, Judge had written in her ruling. While the presence of Officer Mitchell's dog Rex provided comfort in this courtroom, I believe that having a consistent, ongoing animal companion in the home environment could provide similar regulatory benefits and support Maya's reintegration into normal developmental pathways. 2 weeks after the hearing, Sarah made the decision to visit the Denver Animal Shelter. She hadn't initially planned to adopt. She wanted to take time to make sure they were truly ready to find the right match. But when she walked into the shelter with Maya, something shifted. Maya, who had become slightly more verbal over the past 2 weeks but was still largely quiet, immediately gravitated toward one of the kennels. It was a golden retriever mix, probably 4 years old, with a coat the color of honey and eyes that radiated an almost preternatural gentleness. The dog's name was Sunny, according to the shelter placard, and she'd been rescued from an abusive situation 6 months earlier. The shelter staff said she'd made remarkable progress in her recovery, but still struggled with anxiety around sudden movements and loud voices. In other words, she was a dog who understood trauma intimately. When Maya approached Sunny's kennel, the dog did something remarkable. Rather than jumping or barking excitedly like most shelter dogs, Sunny simply stood and walked to the fence, lowering her head to Maya's level. It was the same gesture that Rex had made in the courthouse hallway. It was the same language of calm acceptance, of understanding without judgment, of recognition from one traumatized being to another. Sarah made the decision right there. They brought Sunny home that same day. The transformation that followed was gradual but unmistakable. In the first week, Sunny mostly slept, her anxiety evident in the way she flinched at unexpected sounds. But Maya seemed to understand on some instinctive level that Sunny needed the same kind of patient, gentle care that she herself was beginning to receive. The child would sit quietly beside the dog, sometimes talking to Sunny in soft whispers, words that had been locked away for so long now flowing out in a quiet stream of consciousness. Sarah set up sessions with Dr. Martinez, and the psychologist suggested a modified approach to therapy. Rather than traditional talk therapy in an office setting, Dr. Martinez began meeting with them in their home, with Sunny present. The informal environment seemed to unlock something in Maya that the formal office had not. She would talk to Dr. Martinez while petting Sunny, or she would address her comments to the dog while the psychologist listened and documented. It was as if having Sunny as an intermediary somehow made the communication less threatening, less formal, less demanding. By the end of the first month with Sunny, Maya's selective mutism had almost entirely resolved. She was speaking in full sentences, though she was still somewhat reserved and cautious in new situations. She had nightmares occasionally, and she still became anxious during thunderstorms and loud noises, but these were normal trauma responses that would fade with time and continued therapeutic support. 3 months after the hearing, Sarah received an invitation to participate in a study being conducted by Dr. Elizabeth, the neuroscientist whose research had informed Judge's decision. Doctor was investigating the long-term outcomes of animal-assisted therapy in trauma-affected children, and she wanted to document Maya's progress as part of her research. Sarah agreed, understanding that Maya's story might contribute to a larger body of evidence that could help other children. During the first assessment session, Doctor used biometric measurements to compare Maya's physiological responses in different situations. When Maya was alone, her cortisol levels were elevated and her heart rate was somewhat elevated. But when Sunny was present, both markers dropped significantly. When Doctor asked Maya to recall a frightening memory, the child's physiological stress response was intense, until Sunny pressed her body against Maya's side, and the markers immediately began to decrease. Your daughter's nervous system is literally synchronizing with her dog's nervous system, Doctor explained to Sarah. When Sunny senses that Maya is becoming, she automatically provides physical contact that helps regulate Maya back into a safe range. It's not that Sunny is trained to do this. It's that Sunny, having experienced trauma herself, instinctively understands what helps with nervous system regulation. The two of them are healing each other. Sarah began attending a support group for mothers in custody disputes, and she found herself sharing Maya's story repeatedly with other women in similar situations. Several of them asked Judge directly if they could request animal-assisted interventions for their own proceedings. The judge had begun documenting these requests and tracking the outcomes. The results were remarkable. In cases where therapy animals were present, traumatized children were significantly more likely to communicate authentically, and custody decisions based on that communication showed higher rates of positive outcomes. By the 6-month mark after the hearing, Maya had made extraordinary progress. She was starting preschool, where her teachers reported that she was slightly shy but engaged and interactive. She no longer needed the court-appointed guardian ad. Her mother was firmly established as her protective figure. David's supervised visitation had been suspended after his second session, when it became clear that being in his presence still triggered significant anxiety in Maya. The court psychologist recommended that no further contact be attempted until Maya was older and had developed additional coping skills. Sarah enrolled in some college classes, working toward a degree in social work. She discovered through this experience a deep passion for advocating for children in family law proceedings. She began volunteering with an organization that supported mothers escaping domestic violence, and she found that her own story was profoundly helpful to women who felt hopeless and trapped. One evening, about 8 months after the hearing, Sarah sat on the floor of their living room with Maya and Sunny. Her daughter was drawing pictures, a skill that had emerged alongside her renewed ability to speak. In the drawing, there was a little girl, a dog, and a woman in a judge's robe with a big heart in her chest. "That's me, Sunny, and Judge," Maya explained, pointing to each figure. "She helped us be safe." Sarah pulled her daughter close, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes, baby, she did. And you know what? You helped yourself. You were so brave." Maya leaned against her mother, one hand on Sunny's soft fur. And Sunny helped me too. She did, baby, she really did. Looking at her daughter, this resilient, healing, slowly blossoming child, Sarah understood that they'd been given a second chance. Not just a legal victory, but a genuine opportunity to heal, to rebuild, to construct a life where safety wasn't a luxury but a fundamental reality. And it had all begun with the courage of one judge to bend the rules, one dog to offer his presence, and one traumatized child to whisper two words that would echo far beyond her own life. 1 year after that fateful morning when Maya whispered "good boy" to a police dog in a courthouse hallway, Denver was hosting a ribbon-cutting ceremony for something unprecedented: the Animal-Assisted Therapy Program for court-involved children. The event was being held in the newly renovated courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Denver courthouse, the same courtroom where Judge had made her controversial decision to allow Rex to remain present during Maya's custody hearing. Judge stood at the podium, her expression reflecting a complex mix of pride, humility, and the weight of responsibility that came with championing systemic change. Beside her stood Officer James Mitchell with Rex, who had become something of a celebrity in Denver's legal community. The dog wore a ceremonial collar adorned with a Medal of Service, though Rex seemed largely indifferent to the honor, his focus primarily on the treats Officer Mitchell occasionally offered him. But the real centerpiece of the event was Maya Henderson. At 4 years and 8 months old, Maya stood between her mother and Judge, holding a golden ribbon that would officially mark the opening of the program. She wore a white dress with golden ribbons in her hair, and her face bore the serene confidence of a child who had been given back her voice and her sense of safety. Sunny, dressed in a service vest that identified her as a therapeutic support animal, sat at Maya's feet, alert and present for the ceremony. 1 year ago, Judge began, her voice carrying across the courtroom, a 3-year-old girl who had not spoken in 4 months stood in a hallway outside this courtroom. She was terrified. Her brain had learned that the world was not safe, and it had responded by silencing her, a protective mechanism that, while understandable, was also profoundly limiting. Her mother was fighting desperately to protect her, but the system seemed stacked against them. The law required evidence, testimony, proof of abuse. But how do you prove abuse when the most important witness cannot speak? Judge paused, allowing the weight of that question to settle into the room. There were journalists present, legal scholars, other judges from across Colorado and surrounding states, social workers, psychologists, and many people who had been directly affected by family law proceedings. Then something extraordinary happened, the judge continued. In a moment that transcended the adversarial nature of our legal system, an animal, this extraordinary German shepherd named Rex, connected with this traumatized child in a way that nothing else had been able to do. 2 words emerged from Maya's mouth: "Good boy." Those 2 words changed everything. They changed the trajectory of this family's life. And they began to change how we, as a judicial system, think about trauma, about children, and about what justice actually looks like. Officer Mitchell stepped forward with Rex, and the dog performed a series of trained behaviors that demonstrated his remarkable intelligence and calm demeanor. Then Judge introduced Dr. Elizabeth, the neuroscientist whose research had provided the foundation for the program. Doctor spoke about the neurobiology of trauma, about how children's brains responded to overwhelming stress by essentially shutting down certain functions, including speech. She discussed the research on co-regulation, on how animals' calm nervous systems could help regulate human nervous systems. She presented data showing that in cases where therapy animals had been present during family law proceedings, outcomes for children had improved by measurable margins. What we're inaugurating today, Doctor said, is not just a program. It's a recognition that our courtrooms have been designed by people operating from a paradigm that doesn't account for trauma. We've built systems that inadvertently re-traumatize vulnerable people. This program represents a commitment to doing better, to building systems that recognize that true justice must account for the neurobiological reality of how humans, especially children, experience stress and threat. Then it was time for the actual ribbon cutting. Maya, guided by her mother, stepped forward. Judge knelt down so she was at eye level with the child. "Do you remember when you met Rex?" the judge asked gently. Maya nodded solemnly. "What did you say to him?" "Good boy," Maya replied, her voice clear and confident. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "That's right," Judge said, tears evident in her eyes. And those two words were so important. They helped everyone understand that you needed help, that you needed protection, that you deserved safety. You were very brave. As Maya reached for the ribbon and Judge guided it downward, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. But the focus remained on this small girl, a living embodiment of what was possible when systems were willing to evolve, when compassion met procedure, when humanity transcended protocol. Over the following 6 months, the animal-assisted therapy program began operating in earnest. 3 additional therapy dogs, all screened and trained to the same standards as Rex, were integrated into the courthouse. The program received funding from a combination of sources: federal grants recognizing innovative approaches to trauma-informed justice, private donations from people moved by Maya's story, and budgetary allocations from the city and state governments. Guidelines were established for which cases could access the program. Priority was given to situations involving traumatized children, particularly those with selective mutism or other stress response disorders. Protocols were developed to ensure that the animal's presence never came across as manipulative or biased, but rather as a legitimate therapeutic accommodation. Legal arguments were prepared in anticipation of challenges from attorneys who objected to the program. But the challenges didn't materialize nearly as much as some had expected. In fact, many attorneys, even those typically opposed to any accommodations for traumatized parties, began to recognize that the program actually served the interests of justice. Children who felt safer were more likely to communicate authentically. Authentic communication led to better information for judges. Better information led to better decisions. Even attorneys representing abusers recognized that they couldn't ethically object to interventions that genuinely helped vulnerable individuals communicate more clearly. Within the first year of operation, the program had directly served 43 families. Follow-up assessments showed that in 87% of cases where children had interacted with the therapy dogs, those children showed measurable improvement in anxiety symptoms, communication abilities, and overall functioning. Judge began receiving requests from judges in other states asking about how to implement similar programs. Sarah Henderson became the unofficial spokesperson for the program. She gave presentations at legal conferences, participated in interviews with major news outlets, and wrote op-eds about her experience navigating family law as a mother trying to protect her child from abuse. She completed her social work degree and began working as a victim advocate, using her own experience to help other families. But perhaps most significantly, the program became a model for trauma-informed approaches to family law more broadly. Judges began questioning other aspects of courtroom procedure that seemed designed to maximize stress rather than facilitate authentic communication. Waiting areas were made more comfortable. Language in legal documents was when children would be reading it. Breaks were built in to allow for nervous system regulation. The entire approach to family law began shifting, with the animal-assisted therapy program serving as a catalyst. By the 2-year anniversary of the program's founding, 13 other jurisdictions had implemented similar initiatives. Universities began developing training programs for therapy dogs in legal settings. Insurance companies began covering animal-assisted therapy as a legitimate intervention. What had started as one judge's unconventional decision was becoming a movement. On the 3rd anniversary after that moment in the hallway, Judge was invited to speak at a national judicial conference. During her keynote address, she held up a photograph of Maya standing with Rex and Sunny. "This is what justice looks like," Judge told the assembled judges from across the country. This is what happens when we're willing to see that our systems are imperfect, that they cause harm even when we're trying to do good, that they need to evolve. This is what happens when we prioritize actual healing over the appearance of procedure. This is what happens when we remember that at the heart of every case file is a human being, often a child, who deserves not just legal protection but genuine compassion. She paused, her voice becoming quieter but no less powerful. A 3-year-old girl whispered 2 words to a dog, and those 2 words rippled outward to change how we think about justice, about trauma, about children, and about what the law is actually supposed to do. If that's not the purpose of the judicial system, to serve not just procedure but the actual healing and of human beings, then what are we doing here? That speech was distributed to every judicial officer in the country. It was quoted in legal journals, discussed in law schools, and cited in subsequent court decisions about trauma-informed practices. Judge received dozens of awards for her work, but she always redirected the credit toward Maya, toward Rex, toward the team that had come together to make something extraordinary possible. Years later, when Maya was in college, she would occasionally visit Judge's office. They'd look at photographs from that day in the hallway, from the ribbon-cutting ceremony, from the countless families helped through the program that had grown from one girl's courage and one judge's willingness to bend the rules. "Do you know what changed the world?" Judge would ask. And Maya would smile and say, 2 words. 2 words, the judge would confirm. Sometimes that's all it takes, just a moment of genuine connection, of authentic voice, of one human being recognizing and responding to the pain of another. You did that, Maya. You changed the world. And in a way that transcended what could be measured in any traditional metric. It was absolutely true.